everybody to tonight's stream. I'm streaming a little bit late, and this is our first stream in a bit. Oop. I keep forgetting how my camera works. Yeah. So today's stream is gonna be an interesting one. So recently, OceanlinerDesigns dropped a 2-hour documentary about the Wilhelm Gustloff, and I wanted to see it. I wanted to see it, and it's on YouTube. Great, but I wanted to watch it with you guys to learn more about the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff and the things surrounding that history. And I got some awesome news at the end of the stream, so let's start bringing everything together. Come together. Over me. So, I gotta have my tablet so I can see my stream and to double check on my stream and plus to see chat. Because once I leave my OBS, I can't see chat, and my phone doesn't let me see chat. So, as I'm planning to play Roblox today, but thank you pretty much. So yeah, maybe for all chat with. So I bet all you guys things are. I bet mine is running slow over here, so. Yeah. And okay, there you go. There you go. There is my stream there. Tablet, I need to switch it to my desktop set. And then I want to go to my YouTube thing to check on streams on mobile and long form because I'm streaming on both. So yeah, so I'm streaming on both. This is the first time I dual streaming on YouTube, so aware of that. So this is the first time for everything. Here's the first time for everything. Yeah, I kind of waiting for everything to pop up. Excuse me. I want to double check everything. Great. So I might have to adjust how my laptop is, or I have to adjust where I sit based on how the crop is on streaming mobile. And I don't know if people's coming in for mobile. So yeah, so it's really gonna depend if I gain both mobile and long form, or it's only just one or the other. So, or I just gain things. So yeah, I guess sit more in the middle. I guess that's where I usually sit, on the edge of my bed. Yeah, usually it's supposed to be dual streaming at the same time. But I think it'll be fine. Let's see, settings. Yeah, still streaming. It's streaming to the public, so. Let's add. I can't add closed captions while I'm sharing. Great. Stream health. My health is going good. My streaming health is doing well. And so great. So we'll start moving to my screen. We got the video here. I need to get back on my stream back on my tab. See, I'm actually gonna have my tablet on long form. Then I need to see if it's doing it for short form. So I said, sorry, you gotta do with me real quick. I think it's only for long form. It might be for long form. So yes, I did finally add some elements. I haven't figured out the rest of the elements just yet, but we getting there. So yeah, right now we're running. So far, so good. Okay. Let's begin watching the Wilhelm Gustloff documentary. The documentary is 2 hours long. So, yeah. Buckle up, get some popcorn, and I can see you guys on the other side. Do I have to make my things smaller? I think I have to. But right now my laptop is running slow. Okay, there. I gotta make it smaller for you guys, so it's gonna look a little bit wonky. This is the first time I had to adjust it on the phone. And the video.
Panzerfaustschießen in einer deutschen Stadt. Hier kann jeder Deutsche die Handhabung dieses vom Feind gefürchteten Panzernahbekämpfungsmittels kennenlernen. Es ist genauso einfach, wie es aussieht.
I think I'm just gonna leave the video just like this. Actually, I think I could put on theater mode. Yeah, let's put on theater mode.
Auch Frauen können diese Waffe mit Leichtigkeit bedienen.
Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
Woher kommen Sie? Was haben Sie an Bord?
Keine Sorge, Schatz. Bald sind wir auf dem großen Schiff.
Zeigen Sie mir Ihre Papiere.
Bitte behalten die Ruhe und Ordnung. Passieren, die sich den Anweisungen widersetzen, wird der Zugang verwehrt.
It's a bitterly cold morning in January 1945, and here, at a dock in the easternmost reaches of the German Reich, a surging mass of humanity shuffles up gangways and ladders into the belly of an enormous grey ship.
Bitte zeigen Sie Ihr Bordticket den Offizieren am Dock-Eingangstor. Wir werden nur Passagiere mit gültigen Bordticket aufnehmen.
Ooh, that shot looks stunning. I bet when I put the rules of thirds, the Wilhelm Gustloff is
Wiederhole, wir werden nur Passagiere.
Its hull rises like a steel mountainside from the dock, towering high over the heads of those wrapped in headscarves and heavy coats, against the frigid wind and the sleet. The ship, once the pride of the Nazi Party's globe-trotting cruise fleet, rides at her moorings as one by one, hundreds, thousands of people trudge into the relative warmth of her winding corridors. For these desperate, cold, frightened people, the ship is their last hope, their only hope, because hot on their heels is a terrifying fate. Many of these people have been waiting here at the dock For days, warmed only by makeshift fires that burn in oil drums and sheltered from the hail and the pelting rain by pathetic canvas half-tents. But the horrid conditions are worth the chance, no matter how minute, that they might find a place on the big ship which is soon to leave. In the distance, closer than it was yesterday, far closer than it was the day before, is a dull rumble, the relentless pounding of heavy guns and the fall of explosive shells. This is the soundtrack for the advance of the vengeful Soviet Red Army that is cutting its way through beleaguered divisions of German conscripts. Germany herself is being torn apart, and there is no time to lose. "1938, and a gleaming white ship carves a neat path through the ocean on her very first voyage. Her paint shines in the sunlight, and happy passengers chatter at her railings. To be on the maiden trip for such a vessel is a huge honour. But this is no ordinary ship. In fact, she has a purpose unlike almost any other in the world. The happy chatter that echoes throughout the hallways and the orchestra music that lilted from the windows of the dance hall belie this vessel's true purpose.
Am Adolf Hitler Platz steht eine junge Eiche, die trägt vor Sonnenlauf und Lohn. Sie ist uns Vorbild.
Early on, as Hitler and his followers began to find a foothold throughout the country, he had understood the value of endearing the working class to his cause. He also knew that workers would be hesitant to rally behind him if they felt that his policies would not support their well-being. He needed a way to rally even the poorest of Germany's citizens and earn their loyalty. And so, the Strength Through Joy program was born. It was the brainchild of Dr. Robert Lai, head of the German Labour Front, and its basic goal was to bolster the morale of the working class by offering up luxuries they could never once have dreamt of affording, from tickets to sporting events and concerts, government-subsidised activities like skiing and hiking trips. But, most impressive of all, were the dirt-cheap cruises to exotic and far-flung corners of the globe. Back then, the world's working poor could only have imagined what these kinds of pastimes would look like, and in Britain, America, and the West, where strict class segregation still existed, this was the rule of law. But Hitler knew that breaking down class divides was key to securing a strong national identity in Germany, and a critical means of exerting control on all of German society. It was a propaganda opportunity in and of itself. By bringing upper and middle class amenities and activities to Germany's lower classes, Nazi Germany could boldly cry out that it had crushed class divides, unlike the decadent European and American powers, and that Germans were truly united.
I think that could be possibly true, but I'm thinking about this in a light that I want to talk about for a second. Class divides are basically on Oceanliner for how long had they been the thing. First class, second, third class, steerage, whatever. They had always been a thing. And Titanic kind of shines a light on the treatment of all these class divisions. Like, for first class, they got onto the lifeboats first. Then third class, according to films, that third class was locked down below decks. But in real life, none of the gates are locked. None of them. So Titanic really shows the flaws of the class divisions and why. Now I can see why Germany would go with that approach. Break down the class divisions that plague Britain, America, and the rest of the countries to make Germany the best one out of everything. But I feel like any way you spin it, it's gonna look good. So this is before Hitler's reign. Like, not right before Hitler's reign, because I think Hitler was in power. There you go. The monetizer saying the man's name. But, before he started releasing a plague on the earth. Just say that much.
This manifested on their ships as well. British ocean liners crossed the Atlantic as they always had, with strict segregation between first, second and third class. But Germany's Strength Through Joy ships would be single-class vessels. First to join the Strength Through Joy fleet were ships like the old Oceana of 1912, one of Hamburg America Line's ocean liners, operating under charter. Passengers streamed aboard for a once-in-a-lifetime visit to the Norwegian fjords, or a trip to sunny Madeira, for a quarter to a third the cost of a similar voyage with any other carrier. But these affordable and luxurious holidays had one very important catch. Strength Through Joy was, first and foremost, intended to function as a giant propaganda tool for the Nazi cause, and since those functions were entirely organised by the government, it would come as no surprise to learn that travellers aboard Strength Through Joy ships would find themselves steeped in Nazi propaganda almost from the moment they stepped on board. Here, completely cut off from the outside world, travellers would be treated to Hitler's speeches played daily over the loudspeakers. On-board events and parties were rife with German nationalist culture, and shore excursions featured lectures and tours which coloured information with Nazi rhetoric. Even when not occupied by the staggering array of propaganda-fueled activities on board, passengers needed to be careful not to let any disloyalty to the party show at any time, because Gestapo spies were known to roam among the travellers, looking for anyone who seemed hostile or unfriendly to the cause.
That sounds scary as heck. Just imagine. Early, probably late 1930s. The Great Depression is in full swing. There is this man that's taking up the power or gaining power, then you get bombarded with Nazi propaganda. You can't show any disloyalty or you get absolutely offed by the government. And that's incredibly scary to hear.
Taken together, this turned the ship into a floating indoctrination machine. By keeping travellers happy, entertained, and well-fed, they would be hard-pressed to find fault with the regime that was responsible for their once-in-a-lifetime holiday and all the fond memories that came with it. By the time the voyage was over, passengers disembarked with newfound loyalty and respect for the Nazi regime. It was hoped by the government that the result of this scheme would be an energised, if indoctrinated, German working public. But probably nobody could have expected just how successful the plan would be, because in its first year alone, 2.3 million people took part in Strength Through Joy cruises and vacations. The party had originally acquired a fleet of 9 ships, but as demand continued to grow, it became obvious that the Strength Through Joy cruise program needed something bigger and better. A ragtag fleet of 20 or 30-year-old Edwardian liners just wasn't going to cut it. A modern Germany needed a modern flagship, and as demand surged, plans got to work on a pair of ships that could fit the bill. The steel cutting got underway in August 1936 at Blohm und Voss, that legendary shipyard in Germany's north, which would birth the battleships Bismarck, Tirpitz, and countless others. The Hamburg yard had a tradition of fine shipbuilding dating all the way back to the 1870s, and they were the perfect choice to build the Nazi Party's new cruise flagships. The plans called for a pair of sister ships over 680 feet, 208 metres long, with a 25,000-ton bulk. They wouldn't compete for size, and they weren't built for speed records. They didn't have to be. These two ships would serve one simple purpose: to bring the Strength Through Joy program into the modern age and to show the world, and the German public, that even in its merchant ships, Germany was leading the charge. By March 1937, on the slip at Bloemfontein rose the towering hulk of the second of the sisters. At her bow, high above the heads of the crowd gathered to see her launch, and picked out in black Fraktur lettering, was the name of a murdered Nazi Party official. Wilhelm Gustloff had led the Swiss Nazi movement, but then a young Yugoslav named David Frankfurter politely entered the family home as a guest, stormed into his office and shot him 5 times with a revolver. "I fired the shots because I am a Jew," Frankfurter had simply explained when he was arrested. The party was never keen to let an assassination go by without serving some propagandistic purpose. The Nazi Party anthem itself was called the Horst Wessel Lied, named after another murdered party member, and now Nazi Germany's newest and greatest passenger ship would bear Gustloff's name. One day, it would be used again, applied to a slave labour armaments factory at Buchenwald concentration camp. But in 1937, with a speech from the Strength Through Joy leader Robert Lai, and after a christening by Gustloff's widow, the ship had rumbled down the ways into the Elbe River. It had taken 10 months for Hamburg's yard workers to turn the empty steel hulk into a working ship.
10 months for the Wilhelm Gustloff to be built? I expected longer than that. The reason why I expected longer than that, because Titanic, I guess, this was smaller than the Gustloff, but it took Titanic 3 months to get built, not 10. I guess this is at the construction site, I guess.
They had toiled to fill her hull with the elegant but simple interiors that marked her out as a modern passenger vessel. As a single-class ship, Gustloff's simple kind of luxury could be enjoyed by all, less so the private suite, which had been earmarked for the Führer himself, should he ever fancy a trip away. Where Strength Through Joy passengers had once tolerated the aging majesty of the old 1910s ships the movement had originally operated, now they basked in absolute modernist glory. But even before the maiden voyage, the Wilhelm Gustloff had already seen drama. Curiously, the maiden voyage itself wasn't actually her first trip. That had come shortly after completion, with a 3-day North Sea cruise in March 1938, intended to function as a trial run. The ship was filled to capacity with a carefully curated list of passengers composed mainly of Bloemfontein employees who had actually worked on her. This was another bit of planned propaganda. Usually in Britain or America or anywhere else, a shipyard's workers would never find themselves travelling on the very vessel they helped to build. But the minds behind the Strength Through Joy program knew that this would be a great publicity move. With her maiden voyage still another month away, the Germans knew better than to let their brand new toy sit idle.
Give me a second. We got it. My dog is lay down.
In the few weeks leading up to the maiden voyage, the Wilhelm Gustloff took part in no less than 5 more test trips. The first had been a simple trial to address some issues that had been noticed. The second, another 3-day exclusive cruise meant for Bloemfontein employees and their families. Then, on April 1st, 1938, a group cruise, with the ship sailing out to meet 3 other Strength Through Joy ships, the Der Deutsche, the Oceanliner and the Sierra Cordoba, for a jaunt through the North Sea. The 4 vessels headed straight into a spring storm that whipped the sea up into towering waves. Through the airwaves came a shrill SOS call from a British coastal steamer, Pegaway, which had gotten caught in the same storm off the coast of the Netherlands and was severely damaged. She was going down, so Gustloff's captain Luber ordered his crew to make full power, and just 2 hours later, the ship arrived on the scene alongside 2 other steamers. Despite almost losing a lifeboat full of their own men to the storm, Gustloff's crew managed to haul the full crew of 19 men from the foundering steamer. Captain Ward of the Pegaway raised his glass in a toast honouring Luber and his crew, saying, "The Germans are fair comrades, and they have good ships." The Gustloff made a triumphant return to Hamburg, Germany, where the rescued British were met with thunderous welcome, and the Germans were awarded a silver plaque by the British Board of Trade. Joseph Goebbels himself could not have dreamt of better headlines the following morning, as the Reich's newest and finest ship had become an international symbol of heroism before she had even undertaken her official maiden voyage. Here was the physical manifestation of Germany's might and glory. The nation, which had so recently suffered humiliating depravities after the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression, which had seen its greatest merchant ships handed over to the victorious Allied powers as reparations, could now point to the Wilhelm Gustloff and her sister ship, Robert Lai, as symbols of their return to glorious power. But, as Nazi officials, factory workers and their families, and army officers sipped beer and danced into the late hours aboard their ship, back home in Germany, tensions were rising. The Führer, born an Austrian, had looked longingly at his homeland on the map with its large population of ethnic Germans. On March 12, 1938, as the Wilhelm Gustloff was still being worked up, Wehrmacht troops had poured over the border and they were greeted to a hero's welcome by the jubilant crowds. But, despite the pomp, the Anschluss of Austria would need to be ratified with a plebiscite vote. Wilhelm Gustloff motored into English waters and anchored 3 miles, or 5 kilometres offshore, from the Tilbury docks in London. Hundreds of Germans and Austrians were ferried aboard to cast their vote. On that first trial run, the Gustloff had carried hundreds and hundreds of Austrians. Unsurprisingly, of the more than 2,000 votes counted on board, supposedly only 10 were against the unification. The pattern seemed to match the rest of Austria's voting. Of course, Hitler had privately declared that even if the result had been opposed to the Union, he'd never have accepted it because of what he described as widespread fraud. Never mind the fact German troops had frog-marched into the nation. Never mind that nearly 10% of the entire Austrian population, mostly Jews or political enemies, were barred from voting, or that its people were being invited to cast their vote aboard a Nazi party ship. Austria became a part of the German Reich, with a proclaimed 99.7% approval. In truth, the Gestapo itself estimated that about 3/4 of the Austrian population had instead voted for independence. The fraud was Hitler's, and the Wilhelm Gustloff had played her role in it. So, with all that behind her, the Wilhelm Gustloff at last began her maiden voyage on April 21st, 1938, bound for Madeira. But the very next morning, while directing from the bridge, Captain Karl Luber suffered a huge, sudden heart attack and died on the spot. It was an ominous portent of the unhappiness to come, but the voyage continued when the ship was met mid-ocean by another vessel, and an interim captain stepped aboard, the grey-haired Friedrich Petersen. He was a veteran of command, a merchant captain of Oceanliners from years back, but this wasn't to last, and after this voyage, he would be replaced. Still, he guided the ship on its way, and the maiden voyage could finally begin in earnest. Wilhelm Gustloff had been designed to thrill good Nazis and their families, not to compete with the grand transatlantic liners that outsized and outsped her on the regular runs from Liverpool and Southampton to New York.
That is interesting. on the main voyage, the captain died. That's like a big omen at that point. Has to be an omen, because right now we only 18 minutes into a 2-hour documentary about, I guess, the full-on story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, because we're taking one about almost a year at a time, I guess. Yeah, this is gonna be a long stream with you guys.
At 25,000 gross registered tons, she was a good-sized ship, but still totally outclassed by the likes of Cunard's 80,000-ton behemoth Queen Mary, or the similarly sized palatial Normandy of France. Of course, that didn't matter. The Robert Lye and the Wilhelm Gustloff were intended to show that size and speed didn't really matter, that Germany had money to spare and could bring luxury and comfort even to the lower classes. The clerk, the bootmaker, the factory worker, the housewife. They could all enjoy, for a fraction of the cost, what some would have to pay months' worth of wages for in the Queen Mary or the Normandy, and pay they did. The Strength Through Joy cruises became only more popular. By the late 1930s, the Strength Through Joy program was the world's largest tourism operation. Hundreds of thousands, millions of Germans stepped foot aboard the ships to see the world. Wilhelm Gustloff and her sister Robert Lye were, of course, the shining jewels of the fleet. Blohm and Voss had done their work well, and not a piece of that 25,000 gross registered ton bulk was put to waste. The ship's interior was spread over 10 decks. Passengers had access to 8 of them. At the very bottom of the ship, the double bottom, were the machinery spaces. As a modern ship, at the very cutting edge, Wilhelm Gustloff eschewed the old steam power that so characterised the early part of the century and the British-dominated one before it. Instead, she carried immense German-built diesel engines, 4 two-stroke, 8-cylinder machines working twinned to a propeller shaft. At full power, 30,000 horsepower each, Wilhelm Gustloff could manage a modest 16-knot sprint, but for cruising, she could happily coast along at something closer to 13 or 14 knots instead. The engines were seated almost directly amidships so that the propeller shafts were long, stretching in their tunnels 75 metres, almost 250 feet, back to the stern, where the twin propellers roared through the water at a great clip, around 220 revolutions per minute at full power. The rest of the double bottom was divided up into fuel and water tanks, while above, at E deck, was space for the electrical machinery, and Wilhelm Gustloff made good use of it. The ship was fully electrified throughout, from the bakery ovens to the powerful wireless set and the cutting-edge gyrocompass with autopilot. The wireless station was even provided with ship-to-shore telephones to raise Cuxhaven or Nordeich. Further forward was a specially designated Hitler Youth and League of German Girls lounge, with sleeping space for 20 boys and girls. Then there was the swimming pool, a magnificent affair boasting 74,000 hand-laid tiles and a backlit ceiling that illuminated the whole compartment even though it was down in the bowels of the ship. At the end of the pool rose Neptune, grasping his trident and commanding the waves in the same way the Strength Through Joy program aspired to do. Above, on C and D decks, sat crew cabins, their kitchen and dining rooms, and then passenger berthing, Spartan in comparison to the likes of Queen Mary, but comfortable, warm and modern. B deck brought modernities to sea that some Germans rarely got to enjoy on shore. The men's barbershop and the women's salon, complete with electrical hairdryers. Nearby was the main entrance for the ship and the lowest landing of the main staircase, with a light, open reception decorated with palms and simple wooden furniture. Up on A deck was the ship's hospital and surgery, complete with dentist's office, but occupying most of the deck space were the 2 dining rooms, split fore and aft. As a classless party ship, the individual tables, which had become popular in the decadent West, were cast aside for group settings instead. Together, the two saloons could seat over 750 people in a single sitting, with the kitchen between them pumping out hearty German meals. This was the tallest deck inside the ship's hull. Everything above formed the superstructure, starting with the lower promenade deck, which boasted most of the public rooms on board. At the forward end, a smoking room with heavy, dark panels and a portrait of the Führer and Robert Lai gazing ominously over the occupants. Behind that, the library, packed with something like 1,500 titles, although names like Freud, Marx, Brecht, Kafka and Hemingway were notably absent. Back in Germany, their works were being burnt in hysterical ceremonies. Instead, avid readers could leaf through the works of Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Grimm, and Hans F.K. Gunther, and of course the Führer's own rambling, hate-filled work, Mein Kampf, could be easily obtained for the more masochistic reader. Behind this lay the theatre, complete with projector and stage, the Great Hall, an enormous space that was usually split into three, notably boasting a music hall which centred around a bandstand and a dance floor. Enveloping all of it was a full-length promenade encased in tall glass windows where passengers could stroll or sit protected from the elements watching the world drift past. Up above was the upper promenade deck, the ship's boat deck, where a stroll in the breeze would see passengers dwarfed by the 22 big lifeboats dangling on their davits above, nearly all of them motorised. Inside was arrayed a bank of simple passenger cabins. On the other ships, these would be some of the finest aboard, but on the Strength Through Joy program's Ship Without Class, these were as simple and as Spartan as the rest of them down below. The Strength Through Joy ship Wilhelm Gustloff is the most visible proof that there are no classes in National Socialist Germany, espoused a Nazi rag. The 1,460 passengers and the crew are accommodated equally well without any difference. Every single stateroom has an outward view. According to this principle, the ship has been built. Thus, inside staterooms without natural light have been avoided. Up above lay the sun deck, mainly a wide expanse of open space for games and sunbathing, covered with portable awnings if the heat got too much. In the deckhouse forward was the ship's impressive gymnasium. Physical health was important to the Nazis, so passengers were encouraged to cycle, fence, row, and lift weights to display the so-called superiority of their genes. Up front, gazing out over the bow, was the forward Winter Garden Lounge, a comfy space centred again on a parquetry dance floor, and a tavern was nestled in on the starboard side. Crowning all of it was the bridge deck, chock full with the officers' accommodations, the comprehensive radio rooms, and then the impressively modern bridge. Fully enclosed, the ship's command centre made heavy use of electrical conveniences, simple push-button fire alarms and smoke indicator panels, automatic watertight door controls, alarms and signal buttons, the gyro compass and repeater. From there, that March 1938, Captain Peterson looked down upon the bows of his ship and must have felt a towering sense of pride and accomplishment to be commanding the Reich's very best. But even as her passengers danced, ate, sang and played, back home in Germany, not all was well.
Morgen will mein Schatz abreisen, Abschied nehmen mit Gewalt. Draußen singen schon die Vögel in dem dunklen grünen Wald. Denn es fällt mir ja so.
Those that enjoyed Strength Through Joy cruises must have known a Jewish neighbour who had disappeared. A local shop which had been shuttered with the word Juden painted on its facade. The Strength Through Joy cruises were escapism. In reality, the Anschluss had pushed Germany and Britain to the brink of war. Meanwhile, Goebbels was doing his best to push Germans to reject Jews in their society. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a fine ship, but she was the ocean-going vision of what Hitler dreamt all of Germany could be, an indoctrinated, isolated nation devoid of undesirables, Roma gypsies, Masons, communists, homosexuals, pacifists, the disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Jews. At sea, the people laughed and sunbathed, but on land, the pressure built.
Laub und Gras, das mag verwelken, aber Treue Liebe nicht. Du kommst mir zwar aus den Augen, aber aus dem Herzen nicht.
Denn es fällt mir so schwer, aus der Heimat zu gehen, wenn die Hoffnung nicht wäre auf ein Wiedersehen. Lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, auf Wiedersehen.
So basically there was a mass, so basically on the Wilhelm, the difference on the Wilhelm Gustloff and on land was basically there was a massive kind of disconnect, I guess. Ow. It was basically everything that's, okay, so basically the overlapping thing that the ideals of the man with the word mustache is there on the Wilhelm, but there was my brain is running still 1:13, 11:13, but we have a whole entire almost an hour and a half to go. Oh. We might do a sleep stream next weekend, maybe, I don't know. Depends. It depends on everybody. Depends on.
Wenn zwei Herzchen sein verbunden, kann die Lieb nicht fallen ab. Sie muss ja beständig bleiben bis ins kühle, kühle Grab. Denn es fällt mir ja so schwer, aus der Heimat zu gehen, wenn die Hoffnung nicht wär auf ein Wiedersehen. Lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, auf Wiedersehen. Lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, lebe wohl, auf Wiedersehen.
As the Wilhelm Gustloff carried passengers around the fjords and to sunny Atlantic ports across 60 voyages through 1938 and 39, throughout Germany, Jewish businesses were ransacked and their synagogues burned. The horrid wooden barracks at places like Sachsenhausen, Flossenburg, and Buchenwald began to fill. Just 2 weeks after the Anschluss, Mauthausen's construction was announced and opened within months in Austria. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the floating, idealized image of a pure German society. To attempt to achieve it, millions would die. The German invasion of Russia came as a surprise to very few, except for the Soviet leader Stalin. He'd signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis and then worked to occupy Poland in September 1939 when the Germans had invaded. He had ignored report after report of German troops and tanks amassing on the border, and yet, when the hammer dropped on the 21st, he had been horrified by reports of a huge surge into the heart of the Soviet Union. The Red Army was cut down like the wheat before the scythe, and German newsreels happily captured the jubilant men of the Wehrmacht and Panzer Corps as they swept unimpeded into Russia. The Russian Air Force was virtually wiped out on the ground, while Stuka dive bombers screamed down to support the troops who surged from village to village and town to town. "We only have to kick the door in," Hitler had said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But the Soviet armies fought hard despite their setbacks. Just 3 months into the invasion, Germany had suffered enormous casualties, some 10% of their original strength, at around 500,000 men. The Soviets lost a simply staggering number of men, something like 4 to 6 million killed, wounded or captured. Hitler had kicked the door in, and yet the structure wasn't collapsing. As summer became autumn and autumn became winter, the German armies were ground to a halt. The early optimism collapsed to a kind of cynical wariness. It didn't matter how many villages were taken or towns were captured, there was just always another one over the horizon, one after another, endlessly. The Russian steppes were like a vast ocean that went on forever, and then in winter, it all froze over. The German push wasn't stopped for good. They would just have to try again in the next summer. Of course, the worst of the punishment was borne by the Russian civilians. Millions were displaced, starved, or died of sicknesses. In November that year, the Wehrmacht was bearing down on Crimea. The Soviet hospital ship Armenia was loaded with thousands of refugees and wounded soldiers rushing to escape. Nobody knows how many there were, perhaps as many as 7,000 on the tiny steamer, which was smaller than the Tsar's yacht had been. German Heinkel bombers caught her in the Black Sea. Despite the big red crosses painted on her hull and her decks, they attacked with torpedoes, and the little ship didn't stand a chance. She broke up and sank in just 4 minutes after being hit, and of the thousands who'd been on board, there were just 8 survivors fished from the freezing sea.
Oh, that's messed up as heck. So basically, if you guys don't know, that during wartime, you cannot sink a hospital ship, or it's a war crime. Basically, it's a war crime if you sink a hospital ship, because most ships were supposed to be like neutral. It's supposed to heal people on all sides of the war, and I guess the Nazis didn't take that into not consideration, but I guess they threw that straight out of the window, because they aiming to end the war fast before the U.S. get into the war. And remember, it's 1941, so it's 4 years before the U.S. will inevitably join World War II.
Wilhelm Gustloff had been called up to do her part for the German war effort. As a party ship, she was a conspicuous vessel that had to be seen to be leading the charge. It had begun even before the outbreak of the war, when she carried an entire regiment of the German Condor Legion back from their efforts in the Spanish Civil War to an uproarious welcome at Hamburg. September 1939 saw a permanent end to the Wilhelm Gustloff's pleasure cruising days. She was requisitioned as a hospital ship on the 9th and painted white, green, and red, fitted with a spar and paravanes at her bow to help her with anti-mine work. Hospital Ship D had been earmarked for the future operations to come. Poland, of course, but Norway, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands would see the need for Germany's wounded to be evacuated swiftly by sea. The ship looked handsome in her new paint scheme, and the newsreels captured her doing her part as the German war machine swept into neighbouring countries. Few could have expected Germany's victories to be so sudden and so numerous. France had fought like a lion in the First World War at the expense of millions of its young men. In 1940, it fell in just 6 weeks. The Wilhelm Gustloff loyally followed the Wehrmacht in its wake. It had begun in Poland, landing wounded soldiers of both sides. The next year, in May, after a winter layup with her sister Robert Lai, Hospital Ship D embarked wounded men at Narvik, Norway, where she lay tied up for 2 full months. But the string of seemingly endless German military successes was halted suddenly in mid-1940, when the Luftwaffe failed to pummel the British Royal Air Force into submission. Without aerial supremacy and invasion of Britain, couldn't be attempted. This would have been Wilhelm Gustloff's most important role, but when the invasion was cancelled, she was released from the hospital service. Hitler's eyes instead turned east towards Russia. A hospital ship wouldn't be much use there. Wilhelm Gustloff was laid up instead, and her days as a floating hospital were behind her. She was docked in the Polish port of Gdynia. Hitler himself had renamed it Gotenhafen to give it a more proud Germanic air, and the port would be Wilhelm Gustloff's permanent home. Meanwhile, German troops had swept into Russia and committed unfathomable atrocities. Always behind the advancing Wehrmacht was the Einsatzgruppe and Sonderkommando, squads of fanatics who rounded up Jews and civilians to cart them back to concentration and labour camps in Poland and the Reich. Some didn't even make it that far. In September 1941, a German unit, aided by Ukrainian nationals, shot and buried something like 33,000 Jewish civilians. In Odessa and its immediate surrounds, 100,000 more were shot and burned by German and Romanian troops. In the years since the Second World War, a kind of distinction has been drawn between the SS and regular German army. The idea is that the SS was the sole perpetrator of crimes against humanity, while the noble German Wehrmacht simply fought the war, but it's simply not the case. The war, proclaimed German Army General Erich Hoepner, was an essential part of the German people's struggle for existence, and the struggle must aim at the annihilation of today's Russia and must therefore be waged with unparalleled harshness. German troops understood the message and they obeyed happily. The Wehrmacht took part in an orgy of murder, looting and assault. We have to move away from the position of comradeship between soldiers, Hitler told his generals before the invasion. The communist is not a comrade before and not a comrade afterwards. It is a fight for annihilation. If we do not take it that way, we will beat the enemy, but in 30 years the communist enemy will be facing us again. We are not waging war to preserve the enemy. The fight will be very different from the fight in the West. In the East, hardness is mild for the future.
So basically, Hitler is basically not statement. He's trying to say that he wants the Soviet Union to be gone, because he thinks that if they win the war, but the Soviet Union is still there, they're gonna fight again down the road. So it's either that they're gonna fight down the road or annihilate them all together. And seeing how everything is going so far.
Three million Soviet prisoners of war would die under the watch of regular German troops. As the Wehrmacht swept through the steppes, villages were burnt to the ground. Whole families were shot. It was systematic horror, and the German army, like a horde of barbarians, brought it willingly, and always following close behind was the SS. Often it was the Wehrmacht themselves who did the rounding up and turned the Jews, Slavs, and communists over to Sonderkommando squads as they went. The crimes exerted upon the simple peasantry of Western Russia go beyond what can be discussed in this film. But millions and millions of people suffered brutally, especially women and girls. This was Hitler's war of annihilation, the very pinnacle of Reich ideology. Wilhelm Gustloff rides gently at her moorings, but long gone is the handsome white, red and green paint scheme she'd worn as a hospital ship. Instead, she wears a drab grey and sports a pair of observation towers and anti-aircraft guns. Now she looks every part a warship, but in truth she had simply become a big, floating hotel for a very special cadre of men. By 1945, it has been half a decade since she had first arrived in the port, and now she plays host to a tragic scene. Before her stretches a crowd of 50, 60, maybe 100,000 people, all desperate to get away from the advancing enemy that is hot on their heels. In late 1940, the ship had been turned into an accommodation vessel for the U-boat training division. These were Germany's elite submarine men, who had to first learn their craft before taking to the high seas. The U-boats were absolutely the vaunted vanguard of the German war machine, utterly high-tech. They'd almost brought Great Britain to its knees. German submarines and their men had hunted with near impunity in the early days of the war, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping in effective wolf-pack strikes and single actions. The U-boat arm was the darling of the propaganda machine too, so it seems fitting that the 2nd Training Division found a home aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff. Here, they had been treated to luxuries reserved for peacetime, hot meals and comfortable cabins, all the very best for the finest men in the German Navy. As the years passed, though, the fine fighting men of the U-boat force had begun to suffer. British anti-submarine techniques became more sophisticated. The good old days were left far behind as boat after boat failed to return from patrol. America had been dragged into the fighting after December 1941, and the Atlantic Destroyer Force guided Allied convoys that carried invaluable goods and fighting equipment, not just to Britain, but to Russia. The Arctic convoys battled the ocean itself with fierce, year-round winds and heavy seas. The toll was disastrous, but America had ships to spare. At their highest capacity, American yards could pump out a good-sized cargo ship in just a few weeks. They would build no fewer than 6,000 emergency cargo ships throughout the war, but the Germans didn't have U-boats and trained crews to spare. As the convoy system improved and the Allies began to hunt the U-boats with greater accuracy, the losses mounted, and they became completely untenable. Famously, there were very few wounded U-boat men. You either lived together or died as one. Of 40,000 men who served aboard German U-boats, 30,000 would never return, a 75% casualty rate that made it the deadliest of any branch of service on any side for the entire war. But, even as late as 1944, as the tide of war was turning heavily against the Germans, engineers and designers had developed a miraculous answer, the Type 21 U-boat. It was an enormous leap forward, able to go as fast underwater as most big ships could go above. It was an all-electric boat, a portent of things to come, and extremely deadly, difficult for the Allies to detect. Hitler had promised all kinds of insane wonder weapons, but the Type 21 truly fit the bill. Now it was down to the beleaguered shipyards to work their magic and make as many as they could, while the training division would work overtime to replace the losses in skilled crews to man them. With the seas choked with futuristic electric boats, the Kriegsmarine might be able to turn the tide. The men had come aboard Wilhelm Gustloff and settled into a steady schedule of lectures and tests. They were told they would be Germany's saviours, that they were the best of the best, and they believed it too. Wilhelm Gustloff had been connected to shore power and steam and had her own machinery mothballed for years, and aside from a brief dry docking to remove the year's worth of marine growth from her underside, she had sat idle while the U-boat men trained in big tanks in the warehouses on the dockside. The years had passed quietly at Gottenhafen, aside from the occasional air raid, but then in late 1944 things had become very serious. In Russia, Germany had enjoyed that early string of victories before stopping for the winter in late 1941. Then, with the spring thaw, they tried again and carved their way as far as Stalingrad. Aside from bearing the Russian leader's name at its position on the Volga River, Stalingrad was of relatively little importance, but capturing it would prevent Russian reinforcement of Moscow, some 900 kilometers north. And early on, the city's defenses had crumbled despite a spirited fight. The German troops were shocked to discover that gun positions, which had fought day and night, had only been overrun after immense effort and heavy losses had been operated entirely by women, and it was here, at this city, that the Red Army would make its final brutal stand. German generals were horrified to find that the Soviet army, which had suffered incalculable millions of casualties since the invasion last June, was able to raise fresh infantry and tank divisions seemingly from nowhere. The entire German 6th Army was ground into pulp at Stalingrad and fighting from street to street and house to house. Then it was surrounded, cut off, and, finally, surrendered. It began a shocking German retreat that saw the Red Army reversing the advance the Wehrmacht had so enjoyed. Back they went, kilometre after agonizing kilometre. Everywhere the Russian troops recaptured, they found evidence of Nazi barbarity. Peasant families buried in their yards, towns simply disappeared. In summer 1944, the British, Canadians, and Americans had stormed ashore at Normandy to open up a second front, but the German divisions were being utterly decimated and worse in the east. Operation Bagration saw 500,000 German troops destroyed, wounded, or captured, and then another 300,000 cut off in a pocket at Courland. Germany's young men were being ground into the Russian mud, and the Eastern Front became a hell where youth and laughter went to die. By late 1944, the Soviets had pushed the German army back to Poland, and then made plans for the assault on Germany itself. That would come in January 1945 with the brutal invasion of East Prussia. On the Wilhelm Gustloff, the first sign that something was wrong was when training for the U-boat men had stopped in December, and then the men were handed shovels to dig anti-tank ditches outside the town. Throughout January 1945, the terrified, freezing civilians who did their best to shelter from the worst of the sleet and the rain had arrived after days or even weeks on foot, carrying everything they could because of news from the east. The Red Army had smashed into Prussia, and the Soviet men, deprived, war-weary, and whipped into a frenzy by their own propaganda machine, began to exact a horrendous vengeance on the German populace. What the German army had done to the Russians, Ukrainians, and others from 1941, the Soviet army exacted tenfold. The brutality, the torture, the deprivation exacted by the bloodthirsty Red Army men is hard to comprehend, impossible to describe in any meaningful way, in any language. One of the first German villages to fall had been Nemersdorf the year prior. A determined fight by the German army had recaptured the town, and horrified troops had beheld a scene seemingly from hell. Some of the citizens had been stripped and nailed to barn doors. Infants weren't spared. The Nazi propaganda machine didn't cover it up. Instead, Goebbels blasted the story in every newsreel and paper he could to try to sway the Western Allies to take up the fight against the barbarous Russians. And the effect was actually to instill a mass panic among the German civilians who now began to flee in the face of Soviet retribution. It was better to die, many young German girls knew, than to fall into the hands of the Soviets. Now, from Germany's easternmost lands, they amassed at ports, desperate to escape. To go by sea was an attractive option. It would be a quick voyage further west, whereas trains could be hunted and bombed by marauding Allied aircraft. Goebbels' propaganda machine called the civilian populace to take up arms. Newsreels showed elderly German men and housewives practicing with Panzerfaust rocket launchers to smash Russian tanks. The Volkssturm called up any able-bodied man, woman, or child to make a final determined stand against the Soviet war machine, but in practice, they were worse than useless, machine-gunned down en masse, and a constant nuisance to German troops who found they simply got in the way and created confusion. The vast majority of German civilians in the east didn't bother with their Panzerfauste, they fled, and so it was, that freezing January in 1945, that thousands and thousands of people clogged Gottenhafen's streets and docks, desperate to get away somewhere, anywhere that might protect them from the horrors in the east. The Wilhelm Gustloff, towering over the dock with reassuring solidness, was their only hope. Captain Friedrich Petersen gazes down on the crowd with a fixed, worried gaze. He hasn't been aboard this ship since before the war, when he had taken over in the wake of Captain Luber's fatal heart attack. Now he feels the chill sting his neck and eyes as he looks over the bridge wing at the tens of thousands of desperate women and children far below him. The situation seems hopeless. On the bridge stands another figure in a heavy leather coat, a U-boat man with a dog beside him. Wilhelm Zahn had been a submarine officer at the war's outbreak before he got his own command, and had gained some notoriety for leading an attack on the British battleship Nelson as she was carrying Winston Churchill. But frustrated by his lack of success, Zahn had been pulled from active service on submarines when Admiral Karl Dönitz had found his tactics to be lacking. In 1942, the 32-year-old Zahn, as Korvettenkapitän, had been appointed to oversee operations aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, and he took to his new role with a vigour typical of a young man who has a point to prove. His presence on the bridge was not unusual. As head of the U-boat division on board, Zahn was the most senior officer on the ship. But this would bring him into confrontation with Petersen, the aging merchant captain who was supposed to be the vessel's master.
So now we to a point that now I can start talking a little bit more, because I feel like I couldn't talk for the last 41 minutes. So that warp. Oh. I need to make my chat visible. Yeah. What's up, y'all? Warp. Basically, now we basically to a point in the story that now I can start trying to throw in some points that I know about the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. I don't know much about the story, but I know a little bit more than some people do. So basically, at this point in the Wilhelm Gustloff story, as Mike Brady said, there was a huge displacement of German people to get out of that area because of the Russian army coming. And there became an Operation Hannibal, I think that's what the name of the operation was. Please fact check me. We gotta upload. This is the VOD or upload. This is a full on video. I don't know. It depends. But I'm this story is very interesting, and I feel like I couldn't talk in the first 50 more minutes. No, but because I don't really know much about the first beginning half of the Wilhelm Gustloff story. I only know the late half on the sinking, and I guess the rest of the documentary is probably going to lean more towards to the sinking, the days leading up to the sinking, to a lot more of the aftermath. I think that I can watch the rest of. Let's make this a day 2. Let's make this a day 2-day parter of this thing. So yeah, so I'm gonna pause the thing here at 51 minutes and 10 seconds. In the morning, we're gonna start streaming again. I don't know how early. I don't know if I'm gonna do the exact same. I don't know if I'm gonna continue this or do a whole different stream entirely. I'm probably gonna do an editing stream that I could be editing on stream. One of the videos is gonna come out to the next week. So yeah. So thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe until next time. Stay curious. Love you guys.